I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that 2023 was a fruitful year for gaming, filled with interesting new releases that you've either heard about or already had a chance to play. For me, on top of new stuff, I've also gone back and played many older games as well, of varying genres. I'll only be ranking what I have finished, or in the case of games that don't really have an ending, games that I feel like I have experienced enough of to make a proper judgment on. And barring the few at the very bottom, I have enjoyed my time with most of them in different ways. I know 37 isn't a lot compared to some, but I've decided to rank them all in this video as a little writing exercise, because why not? Don't take the placements too seriously, as at the end of the day, this video is just one big excuse to talk about these games more than anything. Let's begin.
Could you give us some of your political beliefs?
Kill everyone now!
At the bottom of the barrel we have Fire Emblem The Binding Blade, which is a game that can't help but feel artificial in most of its aspects. The difficulty feels fake, as the game's low hit rates and long maps full of winding corridors only serve to pad out its length, while the story and the characters feel mostly empty, seeing as The Binding Blade doesn't actually have anything interesting to say. It's also bizarrely insistent on trying to force you to play it a specific way, requiring you to complete maps in a certain amount of turns or to keep your certain characters alive if you want to see the true ending, or even forcing you into complete a different route without telling you why. None of this is wholly bad by itself, but it's the lack of communication to the player that kills it. As a result, all of these unspoken rules lead to a very restrictive and often arbitrary experience, which is a bad verdict for any strategy RPG. On top of all this, it doesn't feel completely finished either. It's not that hard to spot lazy map design or finger to that the developers straight up forgot to program, not to mention the final boss being a complete joke, especially compared to its counterparts from the series. Being the 6th Fire Emblem game, it doesn't really learn from its predecessors or innovate on the formula much at all, and ends up feeling very derivative. It very much feels like a game that doesn't know what it wants to be, which makes total sense if you consider that this was the first Fire Emblem that was made without its original creator, and that lack of vision really shows. And since this was the last mainline title from the series that I had left to play, a lot of my disappointment with the game stems from wanting to expect better from it, and knowing how much it really lacks when compared to most of the other entries, which does leave me wondering what I would have thought of it had it been one of my first instead, although part of me thinks that if this was the case, I wouldn't have wanted to continue playing Fire Emblem in the first place.
Your intellect is as weak as your dollar.
Next is Like a Dragon Ishin, specifically the remake of a previously Japan-exclusive title that came out in 2023. I was initially excited for this, as this title has always had a tinge of mystery to it since it was never translated before, but I would frequently hear it praised even by people who don't speak the language. Now that it has finally been localized and brought over to modern systems in English, there was no reason not to try it. Unfortunately, the hype died down pretty quickly when I had actually gotten my hands on it. The story failed to grab me in any significant way, as the protagonist came off as an incredibly shallow character that gets everything to go his way and doesn't go through any real development, leading me to not care about him, which is doubly ironic considering his face being that of Kazuma Kiryu, a man to whom I have plenty of attachment to at this point after having played the entirety of the Yakuza series, and his historical basis on Sakamoto Ryoma, a pretty remarkable person in Japanese history to say the least. The faces of the other characters also being lifted from several recognizable figures in the Like a Dragon franchise doesn't serve to make me care about them anymore either, and overall feels like a cheap attempt to make the players overlook the lack of effort that went into them actually writing them. The gameplay itself has some depth to it on paper, with 4 distinct combat styles to choose from, but in reality what ended up happening is that I could not find any reason to use anything but one of them, as Wild Dancer not only outclassed every other style almost everything it could do with simple one-button spam. It was also the only style that felt equipped for the job, as the other 3 didn't have nearly enough mobility to give you a way out of most bad situations. And with the exception of the final boss, most important opponents in this game had generally the same moveset, which does have a story explanation mind you, but it's a poor excuse to neglect the design of this group of supposedly threatening samurais. As I have not played the original, I am not aware how much of this is a problem with this Ishin specifically, but it absolutely did not leave a good enough impression to make me want to go back to it in any capacity, remake or not.
As a friend, you are replaceable. Farewell.
Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon is a game with a very utilitarian approach to its design philosophy. Its story is bland but functional, its map design is boring but serviceable, and its characters don't waste too much of your time trying to make you care about them, if any at all. Being a remake of the very first Fire Emblem, it is not very interested in trying to improve upon it in any significant ways, at times even finding new opportunities to insert its own questionable design decisions, like rewarding you with new player units if you let too many of your own die, which in turn rewards a very strange and callous style of play, regardless of whether whatever the original intent behind it was. This is not helped by the fact that most of the characters joining your army have little to no dialogue to them besides their death quotes, and even the main character will rarely if ever react to their recruitment. Even some theoretically important story characters will sometimes just not have names, a detail that makes this already impersonal feeling game feel even more lifeless. Shadow Dragon is also a somewhat ugly game, with its rough looking 3D battle models and often awkward dialogue sprites, sporting a very washed out and unimpressive aesthetic that makes everything all that much more forgettable. Its gameplay could have been its saving grace, with its fairly interesting reclass system and multitudes of higher difficulty modes to choose from, except that quickly proves itself to be very easy to trivialize, as almost every map past the early game is easily beaten by simply teleporting the main character next to the objective, having him kill the boss guarding it, seizing the throne, and moving on to the next one. The ample amount of easily obtainable warpings they use and a frankly overpowered weapon forging system enable this, which to me shows either a lack of thought put into the actual level design and supposedly intended challenge behind it, or inversely, a clear desire to make this game a quick and easy Fire Emblem experience that doesn't have to be a huge time sink. Either way, it all results in a game that feels like it just can't wait to get itself over with.
Sloppy!
I wouldn't really call Final Fantasy XIV Stormblood a remarkable experience in any way, shape or form. Apart from its main villain, whom I enjoyed a lot, it doesn't have many memorable things to offer to the player. Basing the expansion on a dual setting of the deserts of Alamigo and clearly just Japan, but in a fantasy setting under a different name of Doma, is a firm foundation in theory, but what ends up happening is that the writing overall lacks focus. Just when something interesting happens on one end, you're already being called back to the other, and more effort was clearly put into the latter region, leaving the Alamigo part of both the story and the world feeling somewhat undercooked. The characters joining you on this cross-continental campaign range from underdeveloped and boring to decently fleshed out and even pretty charming, although it does feel like you are forced to spend more time with the former. You can see glimpses of compelling writing featuring them in some places, but it almost always feels like there is just a little bit of gravitas missing, and I have to wonder why this expansion in particular is such an obvious weak spot when compared to the others. The gameplay contents of Stormblood, with the exception of a few solo instances, aren't anything to write home about either, with mostly unmemorable dungeons and trite fetch quests scattered throughout the runtime that make me think they've learned nothing of their past design mistakes. I wish the music was something I could compliment, but I feel like 14's tendency to frequently use the main motif of the current expansion is at its worst here, making me remember Stormblood as having only one song to its name. It's not exactly a bad song, but it's nothing to wow at either, and it gives an impression of being way too long and doesn't leave much lasting impact, which is how I could describe this whole expansion really. What it did do, however, is demonstrate that this game needed to change the way things were going, because during Stormblood, Final Fantasy XIV was nothing special and overall even kind of sloppy.
Philosophy is basically thinking about thinking, which sounds like a waste of time because it is.
For a game that was supposed to be all about defying fate, Kurohyou 2 ends up as a rather predictable, uninspired sequel. Its new gameplay additions feel more like gimmicks than features, and some of its changes to the core combat are actively detrimental, like the very silly forced quick time event sequence that happens whenever you and your opponent hit each other at the same time, not to mention the amount of times this game asks you to mash the X button to get out of a sticky situation. The bosses that will make you experience this are less characters and more just obstacles for the most part, and aside from a few exceptions feel like retreads of the same gauntlet-style chapter formula from its predecessor. Though being a spin-off in the Yakuza Like a Dragon series, it ends up rehashing not only ideas from Kurohyou 1, but also the mainline entries, trying to emulate their crime drama conspiracy-driven stories to an unsuccessful degree. Combine this with a plot that is more interesting and focusing on really shallow kid characters rather than its main protagonist and villains, and you have a truly weak story. There are still a few moments where good ideas show themselves, but they are few and far between, and only one new character really ended up capturing my attention. The foresight to give you an opportunity to mix and match your own fighting style, but then only make that feature available very late in the game is very puzzling, even if it being an option at all is pretty cool. Many non-boss fights in this game also give you a partner to team up with and beat up your opponents with it together in tandem, which can be pretty satisfying at times. The game's real strength, however, is its soundtrack, which often feels too good for the experience it's accompanying. Probably the most emblematic moment of the whole game is the final boss fight. What we have here is an incredibly exciting track set to a spongy, somewhat annoying slog of a fight against a very confusing and pretentious character. Enemies taking way too long to kill is a general problem in this game too, but maybe playing in all hard mode was a mistake on my part, as all it really seemed to do is just inflate the numbers instead of properly measuring what would make the fights more difficult and not just longer. I'll respect this game for being so confident about its half-baked ideas, but as the first game has taught me, false bravado is something you need to outgrow in favor of a real philosophy.
I wish you could marry Parthenax. No!
Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward has a story that I can recognize as well written, but it's one that fails to excite me for the most part. Some of the leading characters have really well developed arcs and compelling journeys, while others not so much, at least in my eyes. I think the expansion has quite a good setup with mostly good atmosphere, as I find the city of Ishgard and its surrounding areas very cozy and interesting to explore, but the pacing takes a huge hit from filler and boring downtime quests. At one point, one of them even pokes fun at the player, lampshading the fact that they've made you perform menial fetch jobs for many times in a row, which does make it clear that the developers are aware of this issue, but knowing this and yet roping you into these anyway does not help to solve it. Heavensward batch of dungeons and trials, on the other hand, was slightly better, with some memorable examples, but many forgettable ones too, although I would say the real final boss fight did deliver overall. However, the villains, when taken as actual characters, did not leave a lasting impression much at all, and Neop was probably the worst primary antagonist in this game's main plot, and even if I do think they were more so meant to represent the themes of generation-spanning strife between the two people and a refusal to move on from that than to be their own entities, it doesn't really make them any less dull. But don't get me wrong, the writing as well as basically everything save for the villains was undoubtedly an upgrade from the base game, and while the change of the entire voice actor cast wasn't easy to adjust to right away, it proved to be a good decision in the long run. Heavensward did end up as a bit of a disappointment, even if it did admittedly have several strong parts, but I do have to wonder how much my expectations played a part in my feelings on it overall.
Who the hell do you think you are, calling an emergency meeting?
The very first Yakuza game can feel like a very clunky title, as its clumsiness pervades nearly every aspect of the experience. The story doesn't have too many high points, the combat isn't quite there, its music lacks just a little bit of punch to it to really pop, and its strange, swear word overloaded English dub doesn't seem so sure what the game is supposed to really be. But what the game has of in spades, however, is charm. It was a pleasant surprise to have went back to the very beginning of this series and find out that its defining elements were already present from the start. The interpersonal character tensions and the conspiratory crime drama may not be at their all-time high here, but they are solid enough. And the main antagonist is still one of the best in the Yakuza business. Some of the series' most iconic characters find their place here in general, although I suppose that's kind of a given. However, this does not necessarily mean that the Yakuza 1 has that many exciting boss fights, as only Majima and the final boss really bring the heat in my opinion. I have played this game's remake, Yakuza Kiwami, before the original, and I'm not sure which version I actually prefer. I think Kiwami has an edge over this game when it comes to the combat, however it's a bit of a mixed bag, as it changes some of the boss fights to be more frustrating than the original, as well as making you fight Majima way too goddamn much. But the added depth of Kiryu's combat capabilities is appreciated, and I have to admit that a certain part of me does miss the English dub. It was as bizarre as it was captivating. Some of it I definitely enjoy only ironically, but there's parts of it I do believe genuinely work. And I'm a bit sad Kiryu's old English voice actor did not fully come back for the new games in the series, especially now that the character is being given his final farewell. But I think me even saying that is a testament to how solid the start of this game still feels like, despite its age and misfires, which is backed up by the fact that this franchise would continue for almost 20 years now. So despite everything, the funk still goes on. The first fighting game on the list, King of Fighters 98, was I believe my first foray into this series. As a big fan of fighting games, it felt like I owed myself to check it out, as something with such a long legacy and its own cult following was basically guaranteed to be an interesting look. I'm glad I did, since it was not only a fun history dive, but also improved my skills at these kinds of games in general. The more elaborate than average move inputs, and a more demanding execution of them can definitely be felt here the most, and I would say I had a hard time initially adjusting. Another thing that took me off guard at first was the roster, as I didn't immediately click with most of the characters, and having to pick 3 of them right away just so I could make a functional team felt a bit overwhelming. Taking that trial team to the test with the game's arcade mode didn't go well either, as I got utterly crushed by 98's ruthless AI, but coming back to this game after having played more of the series made me click with it and appreciate it more, as it does have some of its own unique charm and quirks, like some of its roster making their last playable appearances here, the backup characters from each team standing in the background during matches, cheering you on for your successes and showing embarrassment when you fail, and the ability to choose between 2 different modes of play for your team, which I do personally find to be a bit of an overkill, but as playing with a spot dodge instead of a roll and having your super meter work differently doesn't really make a comeback and KF. To my knowledge, it does help this game have more unique things to stand out for, although in my opinion, if you're going to have this option, it would be even better to make it so you could choose between advanced and extra mode individually for each character, rather than forcing you to slot your whole team into it, but I can understand how that could have been a bit cumbersome. 98 is far from being my favorite King of Fighters, but I in respect for showing me that even in its oldest era, it had a very strong leg to stand on.
Oh shit, it's Robert from King of Fighters.
As far as bookend King of Fighters games that are meant to close off an end of an era go, 2002 is a bit of a strange one. It doesn't really feature the signature mechanic of 99 to 2001, the striker assist system that effectively transformed KOF into a 4-person fighter instead of a 3-person one, albeit for a short while. It's also, as far as I'm aware, the only King of Fighters game to not receive an arranged version of its own OST, and there's some puzzling and very notable roster of missions as well. Now this stops this from being a fun fighting game, however, as it's still a very solid King of Fighters entry. I have to give it props for reworking max mode, allowing it to give the player much more combo freedom by letting them cancel moves into each other a lot more liberally, which is a mechanic that will come back in the future of the series in a fashion more similar to this version than its initial incarnation, and for the better I think. It's easy to respect this game, but I do feel like it's overshadowed by its expanded re-release, and there's not that many reasons to play 2002's regular version in my opinion. Still, the aforementioned soundtrack and its unique stages do leave it some things of its own, and the pixel character art, both in the character select screen and in the end of match win quotes, still looks very nice, although its stylized official art is definitely hit or miss. This is a minor detail, but I really like how this series' poster boy, Kyo, got a very memorable redesign for this time period of KOF, but I can't help but wish this was also the case for his rival, Iori, and the fact that even the last game in the NES era of King of Fighters didn't take an opportunity to do this is a bit of a shame in my eyes. Wish I had more reasons to love this one in particular, but original 2002 isn't a KOF to scoff at by any means. Jackie Staccato does not feel like the same person he was in Darkness 1 when looking at its sequel, whether it be a different voice actor, the fact that he vocalizes his thoughts a lot more outside of the game's signature loading screen rants now, or his newfound position as a mafia boss, which was a direction I wasn't really looking forward to coming into this game from the original entry. The story in general I find to be 2's weak point, to be honest. The initial setup of a cult hunting for the darkness is good enough to work, but its short length and its incredibly bizarre cliffhanger ending do not lend themselves to it well. The mental hospital sections were a memorable highlight that deserves mention though, and Mike Patton's reprisal of his role as the Digital Darkness did not disappoint. The gameplay is the real star of the show here, however, and it has been uptuned quite a bit, giving the player a lot more things to look out for, both between new darkness powers and sometimes gimmicky but overall challenging enemies that really do feel built for fighting someone wielding these kinds of powers. And combine all of this with finally letting you use mouse and keyboard controls for a first-person shooter game, and the Darkness 2 just has a very great rhythm to its gameplay for most of its runtime. But I have to admit that at times I found myself missing the more methodical, almost immersive sim approach the first game made you take. The level design found here is not bad, but I miss some of the more wild and out there decisions of 1 on this front. And as a whole, while 2 may allegedly be better representative of the source material with its more comic book-esque art style, it never really reaches the highs of the original's atmosphere. This combined with the fairly generic soundtrack that sees none of the dynamic metal of its predecessor, and you have a title that feels like it has way less of an identity of its own. That being said, I still very much enjoy this take on a Darkness game, and it's a huge letdown that we're most likely never going to see a third game building on the ideas of the two, as there doesn't seem to be much interest in reviving this franchise, at least when it comes to its video game adaptations, but I'll still be holding out hope that it's not doomed to remain in the dark forever.
Fighting Vipers 2? Hell yeah, brother!
The King of Fighters 2003 introduces a radical change to the formula, temporarily transforming the series into a tag fighter with active team members switching instead. This works reasonably well, allowing for more dynamic decision making when it comes to character matchups, and interesting combo potential, allowing the fighters to actually work together more directly. It is not without its drawbacks though, as the button combinations used for the switching have some overlap, which results in the blowback attack, a series staple up until this point, to be gone entirely in this installment. It does also introduce the concept of choosing the team leader, which gives them a unique super move, which I think does give even more things to consider when building your team, which was already a part of KOF I really enjoyed. 2003 gives way to an era of new characters, many of which have become my series' favorites, although their iterations here do not feel entirely realized just yet. It is to my knowledge also the only game in the series to have more than one potential final boss for its arcade mode, which does result in it having uniquely more replayability than some of the other titles. Being the last King of Fighters to have pixel art mugshots for the character select screen as well as the windscreen poses, it does look quite good, ending this staple of the series on a high note. While I do think this game isn't fully capitalizing on its strengths just yet, such as having a bit of an undertuned combo feel, especially when compared to 2002, as well as an OST that is, while solid, it doesn't really reach the heights of the past. It is nonetheless a good start to an era of KOF that I happen to be a big fan of, but considering that this was the 10th and the last King of Fighters to actually arrive annually before they would start using Roman numerals in the title, it should have totally been called the King of Fighters X.
I am the milkman. My milk is delicious.
As far as video games go, Milk Inside a Bag of Milk Inside a Bag of Milk does delve into a more uncommon experience than most. I'm a bit ashamed to admit to having previously related to the sort of mindset that the protagonist has, finding even something like a trip to a grocery store an immensely intimidating task, and putting a judgmental observer into my head who criticizes my every decision, seemingly only as a means to torture myself. And I guess me even saying that is more of a compliment to the writing on display here than anything. This odd realism goes surprisingly well with the game's surreal and minimalistic visuals, as well as its droning soundtrack, all creating a very unique, almost horror-like atmosphere. The writing is also surprisingly funny at times, and there was at least one joke that made me chuckle. I'm not exactly sure what the game was really trying to say though. It definitely dances around themes of mental health and processing trauma, but at the end of the day, I don't think I could really tell you what it wants to convey, other than just a peek at this person's life. It's also a very short game. I was able to experience everything it had to offer in just about 20 minutes, and I wasn't exactly in a hurry to do so. I'm mildly curious as to what the sequel does with these ideas, but I'm also not entirely certain if an experimental little title like this really needed a continuation to begin with, as it did feel like the game has said all it had wanted to say. And after all, keeping the milk in the fridge for that long does run the risk of spoiling it.
What happened to Dorcas?
It's a little strange how for a game that doesn't really excel at anything, Fire Emblem the Blazing Blade manages to avoid being mediocre in my eyes. I suppose it might have partially been to my mindset going into this, as I wasn't really prepared to take it too seriously, which has actually turned out to be a good way of enjoying the ride in the end. Looking back at it, it also feels like a direct response to its predecessor, The Binding Blade, as unlike that game, Blazing Blade is a lot more fun with its writing. Hillwood and Hector aren't boring protagonists and have a pretty fun rapport with each other, although I do feel like Lynn, who technically completes the trio, feels like an afterthought that doesn't really influence the story in any significant way. It doesn't end just there though, as this game does have an overall charming cast, even if admittedly not all of them are all that deeply written, being the home of one of my favorite characters in the series as well. If we move on from talking about its writing aspects, I think the game structure does make it suffer a bit though. As in a fresh save file, you are basically forced to both play the game on easy mode and sit through a long-winded unskippable tutorial, which, unless it's the very first Fire Emblem game you are playing, isn't going to feel very engaging. The map design isn't really anything to write home about for the most part, but I was rarely frustrated or annoyed by it, and the level leading up to the final boss is actually quite neat in my opinion, which also feels like an example of this game addressing its predecessor's shortcomings in a way. And from what I have seen of the game's hard mode, it does seem to live up to its name, which is all I really needed to alleviate my problems with the difficulty. At times I feel like I go a bit too easy on Blazing Blade, as it's not really the most tightly knit experience, but I think it's okay to just have a game you can enjoy for being fun once in a while and leave it at that.
These are fake and really ugly.
Fire Emblem Engage is simultaneously a pleasant surprise and a massive disappointment. For every well-designed map and fun gameplay interaction, there's an abysmal story moment that may or may not provoke second-hand embarrassment, or an impressively one-note character that gets introduced. Said character also has a high likelihood of having a questionable visual design, as many members of the game's cast do not look like they come from Fire Emblem at all, and instead hail from an entirely different franchise altogether. The music is unexpectedly fantastic at times though, with many catchy math themes and a strong pre-battle preparations track. This bizarre contrast of quality really pervades the whole experience and makes it tough to really enjoy Engage as a whole. Theoretically, yes, on a replay I could just skip all the story and dialogue and focus purely on the fairly intricate gameplay that this title provides, but I also feel like there's something lost in the Fire Emblem formula when you don't really care about most of the units under your command, at least when it comes to them as actual characters. When a character dies in most other AFEs, there's a good chance I will feel something when I hear the death code, and choosing to carry on without them will leave a serious mark on my playthrough, both gameplay and story-wise. Here, unless that character's name is Zelkov, I'm probably not even going to consider a reset. It's sort of funny that on my initial playthrough I was a lot more overtly positive on this game, but as time has gone on, its faults have become more and more apparent, and it's also funny to think that there was a new Fire Emblem out in 2023 and it barely even feels like it, which really shows how little of a cultural impact the Engage has managed to make. Still, credit to where credit is due, the gameplay is indeed a strong suit. The map design is mostly very good and felt appropriately challenging on my initial run, although I can't really say if the subsequent DLC has really made it a cakewalk or not, and coming back to this to try out different strategies and Emblem unit combinations on a higher difficulty has been a fun time. I really do wish Engage was better than this however, as I really want to expect better out of this series, but fortunately as far as Fire Emblem goes, it's more common for these games to try something new in the next installment than to not.
So this is called the Scrimble Bimble setup. It's where you do BNB into...
A really hard game to rank, Street Fighter 3 Third Strike is something I really wish I liked more than I do. It's clearly made with a lot of love, the sprite work still looks wonderful and the music is quite memorable, but the visuals and sound is not what I have issues with here. Maybe it's just my unfamiliarity with the Street Fighter series rearing its head, or maybe it's my poor choice of starter character, but something about this game just doesn't quite click with me. The parry system being as simple as press forward or down at the right time is a brilliant concept on paper, but when you are faced with a character who has charge moves in their arsenal, which there are plenty of in this game, you're already holding back or down to utilize them a lot of the time, so it ends up feeling almost counterintuitive. I'm also quite disappointed with the combo system in this game, as it really feels like unless you're playing a character built for them, you're not going to get many cancels or launchers worth a damn out of anything, and the juggle limit really dampens things. Furthermore, I take issue with how prominent of a strategy whiffing your moves to build super meter is in this game, as standing there punching the air far away from your opponent just doesn't really make much sense to me, even if it is supposedly something you should be doing all the time. Further pet peeves include 6 attack buttons being one too many, charge moves taking too long to activate, and frequently slow poking back and forth gameplay that a lot of matches can unfortunately devolve into. There's still things I like though. The aforementioned parries are nice when you can get them off. Having the ability to pick between 3 different supers adds some variety to even playing just one character, and this definitely has my favorite Street Fighter roster out of all of them, as it feels like the only one not afraid to experiment with weirder characters than usual, at least at a glance. I've played quite a lot of different fighting games by now, and when you gain more than just a passing interest in the genre, it's virtually impossible to avoid hearing the words Third Strike being thrown around, so I can only pretend to not notice its overwhelming presence for so long. But truth is, even though this game is reasonably good, I think I just enjoy other fighting games way more, and even among my friends it's not really something anyone's ever itching to play. Or you know, maybe this is all just because I'm main Remy.
When you have a bad day, give up. Go home and sleep.
Another very hard one to rank, Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker is a lot of things. It's an epic culmination of a nearly decade-long running story that is messy, heartfelt, and earnest, but for one reason or another it's not something that I find easy to love. It's a lot less focused than its previous counterparts, and it works both in its favor and to its detriment. I can look back on some moments and story arcs very fondly and have incredibly mixed feelings on others, but having said that, I can't really just invent an alternate version of it in my head that supposedly works better, and I don't really think I would want to, even if I do disagree with the direction some of this expansion takes it for 14 in, such as demystifying things that I didn't think needed demystifying, giving certain characters redemption arcs that I didn't feel were wholly deserved, or having villain motivations that I'm still not entirely convinced by. There's a certain part of Endwalker that I think is very well written, makes sense with all the characters involved, and leaves the powerful lasting impact that I absolutely hated on my first reaction to it, because it cuts somewhere very deep and personal that I already had on my mind all too often and couldn't stand looking at it anymore. I hope that in the future I'll be able to look back on that part of the story, and I suppose Endwalker as a whole, with a much clearer mind and a lot less judgment, but at the moment it's all in a very weird place for me. There's also the matter of its patch quests, which uniquely to it are a separate story entirely, instead of a way to bridge the gap between 2 expansions like usual, which further complicates my feelings on it, as I have enjoyed them, but mentally including them with the whole experience just doesn't sit entirely right with me. But I think overall I can respect Endwalker for what it is, that being a constantly escalating and unpredictable final chapter with some of the best dungeons and trials to have come out of Final Fantasy XIV.
Can we get Adelheid as an actual Fido character? I know. I know.
The King of Fighters 11 is something I would call a very strange entry in the series, but in all the best ways. The character roster is the most unorthodox it's ever been, with plenty of unconventional team compositions and oddball characters, some of whom don't ever make their return past this game. The tag system originating from 2003 has been refined, now allowing the player to use it defensively as well as in offense and combos, although it feels a little hard for me to pull off much with it, but it is definitely a show on my part. Blowback attacks return from their previous absence and take up their own button, curiously enough, making this the only KOF with 5 attack buttons instead of 4, although in practice this doesn't feel as different as you'd expect. It also leaves the old SNK sound font behind in favor of a less MIDI heavy soundtrack, and it sounds great right off the bat, especially the guitars receive a noticeable upgrade, but I will admit the old style still had some charm despite its limitations. Unbeknownst to me going into this game, it actually features the most in-depth custom color customization system I have ever seen in a fighting game, letting the player decide the hue of every individual texture of any given character, realistically allowing you to change your team's color scheme however you like, starting from matching uniforms and potentially ending in something silly like rainbow colored fireballs. Those won't help you much against the final arcade boss though, as he is a contender for the most unfair and cheapest opponent this company's put out, which Considering their catalog of games, it's kind of impressive to be honest. But that aside, this is a damn solid KOF that I wish I could more easily sink into, as not only is it intimidating with all of its unique systems, it could also use a re-release in my opinion, as it's a tad inconvenient to play it online at the moment. And it would be nice if the PlayStation 2 version exclusive characters were just made available from the start, at least as an option. Until then, this will remain a King of Fighters I can respect from a distance.
Call that pussy the Matrix, cause I'm in this bitch and I can't get out.
It felt wrong to pick any Castlevania other than Symphony of the Night as my first. Due to the game's rather simple combat system and boss design, the action can feel somewhat lacking, but the real meat of the experience definitely lies in the exploration. Dracula's castle feels satisfying to traverse, and getting new upgrades and finding new items is gratifying. And aside from a few later instances where the game was being too obtuse for my liking about where I was supposed to go, the progression through the environment felt mostly authentic. Ironically enough, those moments of not knowing how to proceed were the hardest obstacles to overcome in the whole game for me, as the game feels quite easy to cheese and break, but bizarrely enough that did feel like a natural part of the experience for the most part. Finding ways to pass through a part of the castle as fast as possible or quickly destroying a boss before they even get a chance to fight back can be viewed as a challenge in its own right. But whatever it is you're doing, the game's soundtrack will always be the crown jewel of this Symphony of the Night. With its signature Castlevania gothic atmosphere, neoclassical guitars, and occasional funk thrown in there for good measure, it's no surprise that this series is so instantly recognizable by its music alone. The pixel art still looks quite nice and some animations are very fluid and pleasing to the eye, especially Alucard's iconic cape sway. The story could be considered the weak link of the experience, but it had a few good moments, and I even enjoyed the voice acting to an extent despite its notorious reputation. I think this is one of the cases where I don't have that much to say about a game that others haven't already, so it's a bit difficult for me to find unique things to praise and critique, more so without the greater knowledge of the franchise. But it definitely piqued my interest in Castlevania as a whole, and I look forward to discovering the other games at a later date. I'll return when Dracula is resurrected again.
You gonna wash your hands? No. 'Cause I'm evil.
Fire Emblem: The Mystery of the Emblem is a strange blend of both dry and fun strategy gameplay. The systems, or lack thereof depending on how you look at it, just aren't as important as rock-solid level design, at least according to this game. But unlike its direct predecessor Shadow Dragon, new mystery maps aren't so easily trivialized, so this time paying attention was a requirement, not a suggestion. Even at the lowest hard difficulty, I found the game to be consistently challenging without resorting to anything cheap, and it has indirectly led to me rethinking the way I play these games, that is being a lot more aggressive and employing a lot more player-faced focused strategies, which turn out to be a good mindset to have, especially for the brutal late game. It's not all cock and ball torture, however. New Mystery knows how to have some fun as well. Jagan can scold you for having bad stats, it actually features some support conversations to flesh out the extras in the cast this time, and there's plenty of silly hats you can put on your avatar character for absolutely no benefit, which is a nice contrast to how monotonous and no-nonsense the previous game had felt. Speaking of the avatar character, as they are a brand new addition to New Mystery not present in the original Fire Emblem 3, it was a total coin flip as to how they would blend into the story, but to my surprise they fit in pretty naturally and were very unintrusive to the overall plot of the game, so I didn't mind them, although maybe I would if I had any attachment to the original before playing this remake. The story itself is not bad either, however I do think it peaks early with its very first arc and doesn't really pick up until you get to the anticipated showdown with a certain familiar face. It also made me more interested in many of the returning characters, but I think on the overall story scale, the two games taking place in Arcanea just don't quite reach the highs of the series unfortunately, and it's a bit of a shame. Still, this game has a lot to respect about it, and its higher difficulties are sure to both interest and intimidate me should I come back to it. For me, when it comes to fighting games, the character roster often either makes it or breaks it. This was the initial reason behind my aversion to Granblue Fantasy vs. Rising upon learning about its release. But after getting a chance to actually get my hand on it thanks to the free edition, I was pleasantly surprised by how competent a fighting game it really is. Despite its more ground-based approach to things, it manages to retain a solid pace to the fights, and the neutral game always feels very active. Having not played the original version Versus, I don't know for sure what systems were present before or not, but all of them come together quite well to facilitate engaging matches, be it the bravery point system that makes for interactive offense and potent but not overpowered defensive options, or the spot dodges and rolls creating opportunities for stylish and effective evasive maneuvers, although I do wish rolling was possible to do backwards, and the dash macro not letting you dash backwards as well is a somewhat strange choice. Another thing I take a little bit of an issue with is the combo system, as its flow can feel samey with most characters, as a lot of them involve finishing a set of normals with a long cooldown version of one of your special special moves to get a juggle in the corner, so you can essentially repeat the process until you hit the combo limit. Its existence also puts a slight damper on things, and thus characters that get to vary up their combos or get something satisfying outside the corner tend to interest me the most. The most notable being Grimnir, a newcomer to the Rising version of the game, whom I enjoy playing immensely. Aside of him, the roster, as I have mentioned in the beginning, mostly ranges from passable and unremarkable to annoying and tropey, which is about what I expected of a fighting game based on a mobile gacha universe. But I will give credit to the free version of the game, as its weekly rotation based format did lead me to experimenting with fighters outside of my comfort zone, most of whom I did choose based on playstyle instead of the design, like I usually do. But it has proved to be a neat way to shake up my experience with the game, as I believe this format to be quite a solid approach to making fighting games more accessible, even if not all rotations are going to be created equal. The character balance is also something that unfortunately isn't equal across the board, but such things are very normal for new fighting games, and I tend to stay with this game for the foreseeable future to see how that plays out. I'll probably consider buying the full version when I get the chance. I might not have gained an interest in the Granblue IP in the process, but I sure did gain an interest in Rising. My journey with Kurohyou mirrors the story of its protagonist Ukiyotatsu in a way. I was disinterested at first, growing frustrated with all the fighting that felt pointless and unfair at times, but as the game went on I got way more into it and actually cared about its gameplay and cast a good deal by the end. It's a very realistic story of a punk teenager who doesn't really believe in anything other than his own fists, gradually becoming an adult through gaining a better understanding of other people around him. It's commendable that Ryuga Gotoku, a game studio primarily known for their stories about middle-aged men, was able to pull this off more convincingly than most. The combat is a grimy blend of their usual beat-em-up style with a sharper focus on one-on-one fights, bringing it closer to feeling like a fighting game. You can still break your opponent in half if you know how, but basically everyone is on equal footing with you here, and whichever fighting style or difficulty setting you choose, Kurohyou is unlikely to be an easy time. And my only real criticism of the combat, besides having low stamina at the beginning, is the fact that there is just a bit too much mashing required sometimes. The game has almost no visible UI during fights, and the scrappy nature of our protagonist, as well as the arena gauntlet setup of the story, make every fight feel real and personal. This is helped by the writing, which tries to harmonize the personality of each boss with their fighting style, and while it didn't always land for me, I appreciate what the game tried to do here. Absolutely phenomenal music accompanies every single encounter and does more heavy lifting than the actual writing sometimes, with its infectious funky grooves and energetic crunchy guitars, all of which perfectly fit the young and full of directionless spite Tatsuya who's always ready to throw down. The cutscene art style deserves a special mention too. Kurohyou takes its PSP hardware limitations as a challenge and replaces high fidelity models in favor of a unique, hand-drawn, almost comic book-like style, and it works quite well. Hearing the announcer ham it up as you see their next opponent enter the ring never fails to bring the hype, with the only exception being maybe the final boss, but I suppose that was meant to be an anticlimax on purpose. Well, the aforementioned things culminated in a very unique and charismatic experience, despite technically being yet another Yakuza game set in Kamurocho on the surface. I may not have loved every single character or every single combat encounter, but Kurohyou 1 has a philosophy that it solemnly swears by, and there's nothing I can do but respect it for that.
Vem aí, a barata Jusukirigashikata.
Despite its age, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure heritage for the future holds up astonishingly well, and ends up more than just a solid fighting game, being an incredibly innovative and ahead of its time video game as well. The stand mechanics of many characters have a lot going for them, and it is also quite literally the birthplace of the puppet character archetype, among other things. But despite having complex mechanics, Heritage is surprisingly approachable and has a variety of playstyles for almost any kind of player. I dismissed a lot of these positive qualities initially though, as I had a hard time getting into the game due to my disappointment with the fact that it features almost exclusively Stardust Crusaders characters, not really taking the opportunity to utilize JoJo's extensive history and enormous cast of iconic faces, and instead opting into some truly strange choices, including some incredibly minor and forgettable characters instead. This, coupled with my ambivalence to Part 3, made it quite hard to pick out a main, and I struggled to enjoy the game in the process. But as time went on, I grew to understand the appeal of this game, and eventually settled on a few characters that I had fun figuring out. The balance, as tends to be with all fighting games, is all over the place, which did not prevent me from having a good time, as for the most part, even the supposedly weaker side of the cast has quite a few interesting tools at their disposal that still makes them worth playing. This game has a lot of odd quirks in general, like many incredibly weird super moves and letting the players move between rounds and the like, that I find to be charming and which gives the game a lot of personality. The fast-paced rounds make for some explosive skirmishes that demand a lot of dynamic decision making, especially with active stand characters, but it almost always feels like there was something you could have done to prevent dying once you know a little bit about the game, and it's a little wonder why Heritage is still widely played to this day, with its metagame still evolving despite it being close to 25 years old. If only this game had a better roster or more representative of the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure series as a whole, it would be nothing short of spectacular, but as it stands, I think I'll settle on it just being pretty great instead.
Oh my god, yes! Yes! I want the gun!
Valkyria Chronicles has to be one of the most unique strategy games out there. It's somehow both real-time and turn-based. It's anime and comic book inspired, yet for the most part still grounded in realism, taking obvious inspiration from real-world events as well as putting its own spin on things with the titular Valkyrias. It handles the subject matters of war and oppression with admirable care, while still delving into the topics in a compelling manner. I like the main cast and their character development over the course of the game, but the extra soldiers in Squad 7 definitely feel left behind. It's fun to have some of them around, but I do wish they would get at least a little bit of a spotlight in the main plot. But I suppose those additional optional episodes exist for that reason. The actual main story maps themselves have quite a lot of effort put into them, with basically all of them having some sort of unique quirk that spices up the experience, which comes with the risk of feeling a little gimmicky at times, but for the most part it works well as a way to make each and every map memorable and significant to the story. Unfortunately, the lackluster difficulty of Valkyria Chronicles doesn't let its level design fully shine, and sometimes even lets you ignore these twists entirely. This is most apparent with the uneven class balance, where scouts are not only the sole class to have good movement, but it's to an extent that lets you bomb rush many levels with them in just a few and sometimes even one turn. It's no wonder that the more challenging maps of the game, especially when the last bosses, avoid this issue entirely. The main villain I found to be somewhat weak, which was not helped by the flaccid final boss fight, but I think the conflict at large and the supporting antagonists do make up for it to an extent. And at least the final decisive battle theme was good, and a definite highlight of an otherwise standard soundtrack. PC1 has a strong identity, and the whole package is a great foundation for a top-tier strategy game, but the relatively easy difficulty is the only thing truly holding it back, which is a shame, but it's still quite solid nonetheless.
And why is he here? He lost.
Like a Dragon Gaiden, the man who erased his name could have probably gotten away with being a lot less than it ended up as. It could have easily been just one huge advertisement for the next mainline Like a Dragon game meant to come out only several months after it, and then fade away into relative obscurity when that said game would release. What it does instead is provide an experience with a strong identity of its own, successfully achieving a difficult task of having a good story about a man who has been the main character of so many games that there's already been several attempts to get rid of him, on top of being excellent in many other fields. For example, its soundtrack, which demonstrates its triumphant return to the series' roots, having no shortage of hard-hitting metal and groovy synths that I've loved from the moment I became a fan of these games, as well as successfully blending them all with a more modern vibe and production. Its combat, while awkward in places, isn't anything to scoff at either, giving us the best Kazuma-Kiryu combat on the modern Dragon engine we've had yet, falling just short of being great. The final boss deserves a special mention too, as I feel comfortable calling him one of the best in the developer's catalog. It is all in all a very tight package that does its job very well, but despite having a healthy amount of side content on top of its main campaign, it is also not a full-length Like a Dragon game, and while its short length isn't exactly strictly positive or strictly negative quality, it does make it feel like there wasn't quite enough development time dedicated to it, particularly when it comes to the combat. Neither of the two fighting styles accessible to the player feel 100% complete, and things like the arbitrary enemy juggle limit or some frankly overtuned boss fights make it feel like it could have done with some more playtesting. But it is a very impressive title nonetheless, especially if its tight development time deadlines are to be believed. I may have wished for this to be a much longer experience, but despite not knowing quite what to expect from it, I found it to be a very much worthwhile addition to the series. In any game that has a story that manages to leave me a sobbing mess by the end of it deserves to be praised, not erased.
You know what's funny? My cat Ronald the other day just lost a collar that looks exactly like that.
It might not have a 2 in its title, but Valkyria Chronicles 4 feels like a real spiritual successor of the first game, despite the significant jump in both time and number. This is immediately obvious by the fact that the story takes place parallel to the events of the first game instead of before or after. It opts to explore subject matters different from one though, leaving the talk of racial prejudice in the hands of that game and instead focusing on much grayer topics, like if means truly justify the ends, although the hell on earth that is war is still the one at the thematic center of it all. The antagonists are overall a lot better this time, and practically all of them feel well developed and charismatic, and the main cast themselves are no slouches either. But what pleased me even more is the class rebalance, as almost all of them feel equally powerful now, compared to once scout-dominated strategies. I have to say the Lancers felt left behind just a little bit. There's more movement options this time too, as well as a new class that takes advantage of the verticality of some levels. Speaking of which, the game thankfully retains the design philosophy of the original, giving every map unique flair, mostly for the better again. Sadly, despite all of these improvements, my core issue with these games remains unchanged. It's still a little too easy. The new movement tech actually gives way to new levels of cheese, as you can potentially transport entire squads across the land with relative ease, but admittedly that is more fun than just rushing the map with one single unit. I like the setting a lot, starting off on grassy plains but then quickly reaching snowy peaks and icy lakes as if to subvert the look of the first game was a neat touch, and it's a good thing the snow effects look so satisfying. The uneasy victories claimed on these landscapes culminate in the finale that I like more than once I think, and a particular moment near the and made me shed heavy tears, which isn't that unexpected when you consider the consistently solid voice acting that can be heard throughout both of these titles. Didn't think I'd get attached to the cast that much, but the Perilous Squad E-faces did emotionally affect me, although maybe the extra characters outside of the main crew are a bit less memorable this time. I sort of lumped these two games together in my head, but I'd say both of them stand on their own and are worth experiencing. And the only thing I wish to see the series do at the end of it all is to make a Valkyria Chronicles game that is properly hard, and maybe 2 or 3 can fulfill that wish, and who knows, perhaps I'll get around to them one day.
What in Zodiac's glorious name did you just say about me, you little Cubus?
Making a good MMO story is hard. Successfully following up on the events of many years of expansions, not all of which were particularly stellar to begin with, is even harder. Spicing up the gameplay of something that's already been running for so long, to a degree that makes it feel fresh again, actually starts to demand you to pay attention, is harder still. To do so would require the massively multiplayer online game in question to do many impressive things, such as creating some of the best dungeon content yet with a great new system added to it, making the main cast feel like they are worthy of holding the important positions that they do once more, workshopping a scenario the gravity of which eclipses all previous struggles and recontextualizes the central conflict of the tale in such a way that dares to play our entire warrior of Light City into question. And finally, most importantly, creating an absolute miracle of a main antagonist who blows everyone we met thus far out the water, and takes responsibility for our contrasting dynamics so compelling that not even our perhaps unavoidably bland self-insert of a protagonist can ruin it. And Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers manages to achieve just that, to my considerable surprise. This expansion has truly won me over and made me an FF14 fan, despite its slow start. It is the first one that feels like it actually makes its gameplay identity a strength, not a weakness, with the aforementioned solid dungeons being now accompanied by an inspired new take on solo instances, as well as using something as simple as the time of day that you see in a given area as a way to tell a story. The amount of filler quests has also been dramatically reduced, and the general story setup is way more bold this time around, breaking up the simple convention of go to country, solve its problems that Heavensward and Stormblood have set up before it in favor of something a little more ambitious. I even remember a lot more of the music from this one compared to the preceding expansions, but maybe that's just because I like the main motif more this time around. Giving Shadowbringers a ton of deserved compliments, but I'll admit that there are a few more things to criticize here, namely some of the smaller arcs and more minor characters don't always strike true. But truth be told, this is easily the best FF14 expansion for me, and the one that made the game and its high price finally make sense to me. I'm honestly a little scared they'll never top it, but I suppose they don't need to, or maybe they don't even intend to, seeing as Dawn Trail is clearly going in a different direction anyway. But Shadowbringers, I'll definitely remember for a long time no matter what.
No, fuck off.
Caramel Column Inc. is a studio I have a lot of respect for, and with the release of Aznana, this feeling has only grown stronger. Don't be fooled by the fact that it's a free mobile clicker game, as with their previous title it's an actual story with a real ending, which can be easily reached without spending a single dime on it. The simple gameplay loop of going around town to buy and sell different items from and to each shop doesn't need to be any more complex than it is, as it serves the story and the setting perfectly without getting in the way. Themes of identity and fate rear their talkative head through the dialogue, or even its absence, of all the characters, and comes together better than you'd think. But most inhabitants being created with the exquisite in-universe purpose to just do their job, they still manage to grow as people while dealing with issues like imposter syndrome and perceived lack of self-worth. Needless to say, the cast of this place endeared me more than I expected, especially considering its small size. And for a story about trying to escape a deserted town and find your own meaning, biking through these streets feels oddly cozy and inviting, which is in no small part due to the game's fantastic look and sound. Its unique style and prevalent use of orange tones evokes a feeling of warmth that is only matched by its groovy and upbeat soundtrack, which is all killer and no filler, even if there aren't that many tracks to begin with. Bringing this up over the course of the day for several months in a row was a ritual that added some soul back to my life during a period where it was sorely needed, and the true ending was absolutely worth the journey. I can't say for certain how my life would have gone had I not randomly stumbled upon an alter ego on the Google Play Store one day all those years ago, but I'm very glad that I did. This developer's games are like therapy to me, in a time and a place where real therapy is something I've had no luck with. It's hard to really explain their appeal for this reason, so I can only hope what I've said about Aznana today is convincing to someone out there.
Release Kodak blasters. Take only one, please. Kongu, no. Put it back, now.
Rumor has it, Persona 2 Innocent Sin is a fun, wild romp with a cool combat system, rocking soundtrack, and a great main cast of characters. Really though, deciding to play the Persona 2 duology on a whim went a lot smoother than I thought, but I wonder how much of that could be contributed to the PSP version allegedly making Innocent Sin a lot easier than its original PS1 incarnation, even if some boss fights still gave me trouble. Whatever the case, this game's Persona switching and fusion spell mechanics feel good to explore and make use of, and they even find a neat way to showcase how character relationships progress throughout the game through the lens of demon negotiation, which is a nice touch. The cast has wonderful chemistry and there's pretty much no one I dislike, which tends to be a rare occurrence for these types of games. Additionally, the party's portraits being as expressive as lively as they are deserves to be highlighted as well, as makes the characters even more likable. The way their story escalates has a lot of unexpected twists and turns, and the ending really got me feeling a certain way that I can't really go into without discussing heavy spoilers. But let's just say it was gratifying in its own unique, bitter way. And the context that comes from the sequel only makes it better. Rumors coming to life is a concept that kept me guessing about what could possibly happen next across the whole run, and the game's story is quite outlandish in that sense without feeling cheap. While simple, the way they integrate this into the gameplay did feel rewarding, as exploring the town for rumors of better shop deals that I could then turn into reality was a nice touch. What did leave me wanting is the UI and general battle speed, both of which made engaging with the combat systems a little less satisfying than it should be, and I will admit that by the end I was a little tired of the loop and started skipping most encounters. What didn't really hurt the experience all that much, I wouldn't say, and it was still fun enough for the majority of it that I think I can let that one slide. I can see myself giving the original PS1 version a shot to see if these issues are truly remedied over there, but it can stay a rumor for now.
I put poison in his mutton.
Ah, my guests! Welcome one, welcome all. You are no doubt curious about eternal poison, aren't you? Of course you are. It's akin to an ancient artifact, really. With its mysterious charm and irresistible gothic allure, no sane adventurer would turn down the opportunity to venture into the very depths of Bessic to plunder its secrets. Fret not, as should you choose to embark on this bizarre journey, your quest will be accompanied by wonderfully drawn portraits of its heroes. Although I will admit the little models of the chess pieces on display of this strategic endeavor could use some work. Oh well. This is easily made up for by our fine orchestra. These thrilling and inspired pieces featuring biting guitar work and unexpectedly fitting synths will surely fill you with enough confidence to make one run headfirst into battle, will they not? Not entirely convinced by the more by-the-book conventional fantasy side of their repertoire, you say? Very well, I understand. Then you must be the thrill-seeker sort that is more interested in the battle itself, are you not? Fret not, my friend. Bessic's ever-changing demonic landscape is no cakewalk even for a seasoned strategist, as you and your allies will really have to pull their weight and utilize this here leap room to capture its margin residents to truly overcome your obstacles. Don't be afraid to get rough with them either, for summoning them in battle to do your bidding or dismantling them for useful pieces of equipment is very handy indeed. Truth be told, even ritual sacrifice is not off limits, as their recycled bodies can wield many powerful skills for your allies. I know these methods may seem cruel, my friend, but trust me, whichever allies you choose will need them oh so badly. Each of them have their own hostile issues to deal with, it seems, whether it be the enigmatic and twisted witch Tage, the noble but the poorly composed knight Olafin, or the oath-bound but conflicted paladin Ashley. Although I must say, in my humblest of opinions, that Olafin and his party are likely to resonate with a newcomer to this predicament quite well, and their story is a personal favorite of mine. But who knows, mayhaps if you were to stick around, so to speak, with all who pass through here as well, you may just discover the truth behind the grand design of it all. The path to the end will be long, exhausting, and as the sole governor of this meager safe haven I call Isipolis, let me tell you, my honored guest, that many who come back lose their mind, and even more don't come back at all. But I've said all too much, I'm afraid. I am honored to have played my humble supporting role, but revealing any more will spoil the surprises. A journey must always have a dash of thrill in it, do you not agree? After all, what is a man without peril? For the older era of King of Fighters games, 2002 Unlimited Match feels like the ultimate package in some sense. Boasting an immediately impressive roster of 66 characters, it puts the cast of most other fighting games before and after to shame, while still having a few faces to spare surprisingly enough. This is the game that made me appreciate the KOF cast as a whole more in general, as this is the one I was sinking most of my time into when getting into the games initially. Character art is excellent, and the heavy as hell soundtrack stands out even among all the other entries in the series, even if it does lack some fan favorite renditions. In the unique stage songs from from the original 2002, but I would definitely consider it a massive improvement otherwise, and the character tweaks and new moves do a lot for the experience. There's a clear amount of depth that I haven't been able to even scratch the surface of, as this game can feel a little hard to control, but it absolutely feels worth delving into, and even messing around in training mode with various members of the cast feels fun. I think despite considering this one of the best in the series, it doesn't really reach the status of my favorite KOF, as it comes a little too early in the continuity to feature some of my go-to characters, and has almost no story or character interactions to speak of, which is a bit of a bummer. And while a weird thing to criticize, the main menu feeling as barren as it is with no music to speak of is a pretty strange decision that sours things just a tiny little bit. But that aside, if all you want is a wide and deep fighting game classic that still stands the test of time to this day, Unlimited Match got you covered. Having originally come across the mobile version of this game back when I was just a kid, I could immediately sense that it was too good to be free. The King of Fighters 13 might just be the best looking pixel art fighting game, or at the very least one of the best. Both the characters and the stages look absolutely beautiful and animated as smooth as butter, and the renders look badass across the whole cast. The arcade mode features a few surprises as it has unique pre-battle interactions for every character combination and roster, as well as some actual animated cutscenes that look very solid even if there's only a few of them. The story mode continues this idea, giving us even more unique banter and CGs, and even harkens back to the very first KOF by making you select the whole canon team at once rather than letting you pick and choose, but still lets you do that outside the main story. Simply put, all of this contributes to the characters feeling the most alive they've ever have, and even if 13 isn't the game to feature 66 of them, this still does a lot for it and makes me appreciate the cast even more than I already do. Basically every team and fighter gets amazing music as well, and it's probably how to some of my favorite tracks in the whole series. When it comes to the gameplay, the theme, as described by the game itself, is KOFism, which basically means that the game feels like an amalgamation of all previous games, with features like max mode and guard rolls returning, but the main body of interest to me here is the drive system that lets you cancel special moves into each other, which needless to say allows for very fun combos and other creative opportunities. This also makes the game much harder in terms of execution when compared to some of its contemporaries, because mashing buttons can now turn out to be way more punishing than usual, but it's worth it just for all the great stuff you can pull off with the system in my opinion. And I'd be sad about the tag system from 11 being gone here if the trade-off didn't feel worth it. KF13 is frustratingly close to being perfect, but some unfortunate roster omissions, lack of rollback netcode, at least on PC at the moment of writing this, and miscellaneous budget cuts prevent it from reaching its full potential. But being a close second for the best King of Fighters game ever in my eyes is still pretty damn good, I'd say. In the modern fighting game landscape, to me, the King of Fighters 15 feels a little overlooked and underappreciated. It's easily the best looking 3D game SNK has ever made, a clear improvement over KF14 in terms of visual style, and maybe only lacking a little bit of polish when it comes to the particle effects and stages. It refines what made the gameplay of this game's work, finally letting you do EX moves outside of max mode again, putting in some great additions like Shadow Strike, and giving many of the characters the most expensive moveset they've ever had. It has my absolute favorite roster out of all of them, representing every era of King of Fighters that comes before it well, on top of having a massive amount of characters to choose from, and my only complaint is that there is only 2 true newcomers to this one, but that doesn't stop me from wanting to play a very large slew of the cast, and to be frank, workshopping your team has never been more fun than this one. On top of already having a solid OST, 15 sports an absolutely fantastic jukebox feature, letting you curate your own playlist of songs across the entire series, not only for the fights themselves, but also for the main menu and the character select screen, and it boggles my mind that something like this hasn't become an industry standard yet. Regarding single player, arcade mode features some cute exchanges here and there, although nowhere near the level of something like 13, even if they are voice acted now. But aside from this and the team endings, there's not that much content outside of multiplayer here, though the boss challenges are a nice touch. This multiplayer focus, however, is backed up by, at least in my experience, some great netcode, as this is the only modern fighting game that I'm able to play against someone from somewhere as far as Australia without many issues to speak of. At the moment it feels like the game is in a bit of a limbo state, as it's not clear yet if it's going to receive its 3rd season of updates and characters, but I sincerely hope SNK decides to give it some more love before fully moving on to the next big fighting game darling, because it sure as hell deserves it. But please make auto combos toggleable, I'm begging.
Go! Kill this arrogant motherfucker!
Having already loved the story in Yakuza Kiwami 2, the original welcomed me back with its grit and grime front and center, only accentuated by its confident PS2 era charisma that has aged like fine wine. And the game has its own distinct identity to separate from its remake as well. The soundtrack is an immediate zinger, and the relentless and brutal guitars along with the occasional surprise saxophone and pianos topped off by a slick vocal sampling give it that style and age that nothing else comes quite close to. You could even conceivably call it crazy hardcore with a touch of jazz with microphone chemistry to bust your ass. It is downright criminal that Kiwami 2 doesn't feature most of these hits, but I suppose it's got some of its own original songs going for it. However, most of them just don't compare in my opinion. Similar things can be said about the combat, as I vastly prefer the satisfying weight and crunchy sound effects behind every punch and kick piece to cure your throws here, and overall it just feels like a way more complete version of what the first game had going on, being a lot more responsive and far less awkward to play, and even the bosses are way more memorable this time. On my second viewing of the story, my opinions on how only solidified. The themes of the criminal underworld's violent legacy and how its desperate and frankly pathetic conspiratory plots tear people apart and ruin their lives and worldviews still remain compelling to me, as do the great characters in the scenes that explore them as people in ways that feel a lot less stilted than in the first game. The main antagonist still remains perhaps my favorite character in the series, playing into the themes of his game beautifully and stealing every single scene he's in, no matter if it's being intimidating, comedic, or emotional. No matter how lit he is, not every single moment or plot point in this game hits home, and I recognize that it's not the most airtight script ever written, but at the end of the day, Yakuza 2, with its dingy and honest nature, is like a real man to me, and a real man gotta be a little stupid.
He's a hacker. He's a Chinese hacker. Lum Fao. He's working for the Koreans, isn't he?
I think games that manage to make me sentimental tend to get a free pass on all of their flaws, but fortunately Persona 2 Eternal Punishment barely even needs that. It improves on the misgivings of its predecessor already by making the combat flow as fast as you want it to, overhauling the UI so that doing whatever it is that you want to do with its systems involves a lot less hassle than needed, and hey, it's actually a proper challenge this time. Even though the early game was quite grueling until we got access to more tools to play with, it's still a fair challenge overall, and especially in the late game, a lot of the bosses were surprisingly fun. The quests that you take them on with are somehow even more memorable than in instance, and taking an adult focus this time, which does wonders when it comes to working in tandem with the themes of the game, and nearly all of them have great arcs throughout the story. There's a real sense of sincerity with its hopeful messaging here. It doesn't shy away from acknowledging the pain that comes with growing up, but also doesn't consider staying positive despite it all a sign of immaturity or voluntary ignorance. This idea of informed optimism is something I'm glad to have seen expressed in a game, and Eternal Punishment does so with finesse through its general plot and incredibly likable main character. On that note, I appreciate how both titles and ideology give the other protagonist a speaking role in the other game, making them a more strongly defined character, which is something I feel practically all the other entries in this series struggle with. The ending is absolutely fantastic. It manages to be surprising, hit all the emotional beats it needs to, and then some, showcasing the strong character growth of everyone involved, and to top it all off, it makes both halves of Persona 2 feel like they're mattered, which is something I wasn't sure if it was capable at first. I like the difference in their OSTs too. As much as I might have missed some of Innocent's energetic wild guitars, the much more measured and down-to-earth approach of this game fits a lot more with the tone it's going for, although I wish the final boss track was a little different. Eternal Punishment distinguishes itself from its peers with its unique cast and messaging that hit me where it hurt at the exact right moment, and it stands proud as my current favorite JRPG, and that's not something I think will change anytime soon.
Because I'll be able to do something with my fucking guitar in hands that you'll never be able to achieve in your entire life, kid.
To call Hi-Fi Rush a surprise hit would be a colossal understatement. It exploded onto the scene out of nowhere and meant business, but the only kind of business it was interested in was being an incredibly fun video game. The way it makes the theoretically daunting task of mixing rhythm and action styles of gameplay look effortless is nothing short of jaw-dropping. Practically the entire world around our main character moves on beat, and the desire to do sick combos perfectly timed to the music has never been encouraged more heavily than here. It certainly helps that the soundtrack is rocking, not only with its original compositions, but the fantastic licensed picks too, all being infectious rock classics. That coupled with its vibrant and gorgeously animated look gives it the sense of some sort of cancelled Cartoon Network show from the aughts that was denied its chance to become a classic, which fills me with an odd nostalgic feeling for something so new. But if appealing to nostalgia was all that I had going for it, it would have faded from my memory fast, so it's a good thing Hi-Fi Rush is excellent in just about all fronts. Even its story and characters, which don't really need to be anything special for a more action-oriented game, one could say, are well done. The silly tone and the likable cast make way for a lot of genuinely funny interactions that perhaps wouldn't have worked had the game not been so unabashedly confident in what it is. It succeeds in being a light-hearted romp that still has sincerity and charm to spare, all without coming off as anything pretentious, which is something some games could learn from. I loved almost all the stages and boss fights, none of which felt lacking in difficulty, and just about my only pet peeve is the enemies that are meant to be opened up with one specific assist move, but even that can be mitigated if you know how. To sum it up, this game is pretty special. It executes its great ideas as naturally as it is rhythmically breathing. It is nearly impossible to put down once it gets its ball rolling, and I wouldn't even say there's still plenty of room to expand on its already wonderful concept. Seriously, I'd love an encore.
He's gonna do his iconic Yagami skew. He's gonna be like,
Prior to the release of Lost Judgment, Ryuga Gotoku was always a studio I respected, but never found any of their games to be something truly exceptional. Sure, I had my favorites, hell I even talked about some of them in this very video, but nothing was really at a level that felt deserving of being called a masterpiece, at least in my eyes. This is the game that changed that, and I firmly believe it to be their absolute best work. At the center of Lost Judgment stands a genuinely stellar and human ideological conflict with no easy solutions, and the antagonist that facilitates it has plenty of reasons to be called the pinnacle of this developer's character writing, an impressive achievement when taking their extensive catalog into consideration. The rest of the cast are nothing to scoff at either, as they support this detective narrative and its themes excellently with plenty of memorable moments of their own, and it all ends in a way no other RPG game does, and I mean that as a compliment. These games are already known to have solid beat-em-up combat, but LJ kicks it up a notch and elevates it to almost action game level territory. Multiple satisfying fighting styles that can be switched to and from on the fly, juggle combos, and an abundance of moves to make them, and not only them, as stylish as possible, all put against a plethora of well-designed and hard bosses that will give you a run for your money. All of this set to a very respectable soundtrack with some incredibly memorable tunes that stand out even among the studio's many games full of bangers. Even the side content has a lot to offer, as there's a whole fighting style that can be unlocked and upgraded by doing it, among other things like an extra story campaign. Only batch of criticisms I can really scrounge up is the story starting off a little slow, and the style switching being in a set order rather than completely free, as well as I suppose some miscellaneous gameplay sections not being quite up to snuff, but it's barely anything to be honest. Lost Judgment is not only an impressive improvement over its direct predecessor on all fronts, it's also a highlight among this company's entire output in general, and it is my unwavering belief that they will never top this game, and I'll be damned if they ever prove me wrong.
You may know me from such things as lying on the sofa eating cheese for several months.
It's Baldur's Gate 3. I think when it comes to the more western side of RPGs, at least the ones I've played, BG3 makes itself stand out by taking a more personal approach to things, rather than the purely concerning itself with the fate of the world it's set in, although it definitely still factors in here. It's no wonder why though, as this game has some of the best companion characters I've ever seen in anything, as the themes binding them and the story together are super consistent, their dialogue animation excellent, and the decisions that can be made concerning them are pretty expensive as well. And it just so happens that decisions are kind of the name of the game here, as it is truly an impressive role-playing experience with praiseworthy, if still not perfect, levels of reactivity. It is the only RPG where I felt like I could actually play as myself, which is exactly what I did for my initial playthrough, and it proved to be a fantastic choice that led to probably the most memorable gaming experience I've had all year. I made decisions that I think I would have made had I been placed in this world, and I wasn't expecting the game to make me question myself on them, genuinely wondering if I was capable of doing the things I did. And while I most likely can't wield magic in real life, doing so in Baldur's Gate 3 is possibly the most fun I've ever had playing with a turn-based combat system, as its endless possibilities for different character builds and great level and boss design lead to an environment where there's so many different creative approaches to things both in and out of combat that it's honestly a little bit intimidating at first glance. Speaking of intimidating, this game has some good villains with amazing voice acting, which is just the case for all the characters across the board to be frank. It even throws in some surprises regarding its music in there, like its clever usage of motifs throughout the entire campaign, and a boss track that made me giggle with delight like an idiot, all while already boasting a formidable orchestral OST. The only major gripes I had with BG3 have already been made relevant, as the epilogue episode in a harder difficulty mode have already been patched into the game as I was playing through it. I have my specific nitpicks here and there, but that's kind of a given with a game so wide and massive. I don't regret a single hour out of the hundreds I have spent on this, and I already have plans for more playthroughs to which I can't wait to get to once I have the time. Baldur's Gate 3 deserves all the acclaim it has received thus far, and I hope it not just age gracefully, as no game can ever truly be perfect, but at least for now, it really did come staggeringly close. And there you have it. All the games I played in 2023 ranked, if only as an excuse to talk about them. Many of these have been generously gifted to me by my friends. You know who you are if you're watching. Thank you again. I think overall I'm satisfied with what I've written here, and it did prove to be an enjoyable writing exercise in the end, as I was hoping it would. I'm not quite sure if I'll make more videos of similar manner, as this did turn out to be a little long, both in length and time of making, but hopefully in the future I'll be in a position where I can do this more easily should the desire strike. Thank you for watching through this though, really. No promises for now, but maybe we'll see each other again sometime.